Good evening, my dear friends, and welcome back to the fireside. Tonight, I bring you into a house where the family name is older than the county itself, and where, beneath its ancient floors, a secret has waited in darkness for generations. A young heir, the last of his line, is found in the family crypt, and beside him, only one thing remains: a candle, burned down to nothing. No struggle, no mark of violence, only silence, and a curse the family always swore was merely superstition. But when Hercule Poirot is summoned by a distant, anxious relative, he does not believe in curses. He believes in truth, and in this house, the truth has been very carefully buried. So settle in, pour your tea, and let us step together into the cold and candlelit world of the last candle in the crypt. Now, let us begin. The candle in the crypt. The village of Little Hadley was the sort of place where nothing happened, and everyone insisted, quite sincerely, that they preferred it that way. It sat in a fold of the Kentish hills, its church spire visible for miles, its cottages leaning companionably against one another as though they had grown old together. At its edge, along a lane thick with hawthorn, stood Thornleigh Hall. Grey stone, ivy-choked, and older than anyone now living could properly account for. It was here, on a damp October morning, that Edward Thornleigh was found dead in the family crypt. He was 31 years old. He was the last of his name. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Pargeter, had gone down to the crypt only because the vicar had asked, quite innocently, whether the old iron gate might be oiled before Sunday. She had found Edward lying on the stone floor beside his grandfather's tomb, his eyes open, his face composed, as if he had simply lain down to rest and never risen. Beside his outstretched hand was a single candle, burned down to a stub of wax, its wick long since gone cold. There was no mark upon him, no wound, no sign of struggle. The doctor, summoned in some haste from the neighboring town, could offer nothing more useful than a shake of the head and a murmur about the heart, perhaps, though he did not say it with any real conviction. It was Cousin Margaret, a thin, anxious woman with a habit of touching her throat when she spoke, who took it upon herself to write to Hercule Poirot. She had met him once, years before, at a dinner in London, and had never forgotten the curious little man with the egg-shaped head, who had solved, over the course of a single evening, a matter of a missing brooch that had baffled the household for a fortnight. She did not, in her letter, use the word murder. She was too careful, or perhaps too frightened for that. She wrote instead of a most distressing accident, of the family's concern, and, only in the final line, almost as an afterthought, of the old story, the Thornleigh curse, which held that no heir of that house had ever lived past his 31st year without meeting his end within its walls. Poirot read the letter twice. He set it down upon his desk, folded his hands, and said to his manservant George, "It is a curious thing, is it not, that a man should die of nothing at all, and yet everyone in the house appears to know precisely why." He arrived in Little Hadley 2 days later, by the afternoon train, his moustaches immaculate despite the journey, his patent leather shoes entirely unsuited to the muddy lane that led from the station to the hall. He did not enjoy the walk. He said so, more than once, to the young man who had been sent to meet him, a nephew of the family, introduced as Mr. Peter Thornleigh, and who bore the news with the patient good humour of someone rather used to Poirot's opinions on English weather. "You must forgive the mud, Monsieur Poirot," Peter said. "We don't get many visitors who mind it." "I mind it exceedingly," said Poirot, "but I shall endure it, as I endure most things in this country, for the sake of the truth." The hall itself received him with the particular chill of old houses that have seen too much and said too little. The hallway was dim, panelled in dark oak, hung with portraits of Thornleigh's long dead, each one regarding the newcomer with the faint disapproval common to family portraits everywhere. A fire had been lit in the drawing-room, though it did little against the draught that seemed to move through the house like something with a purpose of its own. It was there that Poirot met the family, such as remained of it. Cousin Margaret, who had written the letter, sat nearest the fire, her hands never quite still. She introduced herself again, though Poirot remembered her well enough, and thanked him 3 times for coming, before he had so much as removed his coat. There was Aunt Louisa, Edward's father's sister, a formidable old woman in black, who looked at Poirot as though she rather doubted the wisdom of the whole enterprise, and said as much within the first 5 minutes of their acquaintance. "Foreign detectives," she said, "were not in my day considered necessary. A death is a death, Monsieur Poirot. Some things are simply meant to happen." "And yet, madame," Poirot replied gently, "I have found that very few things are simply meant to happen. Most are arranged by someone." Aunt Louisa did not care for this answer, and said so with a sniff that ended the conversation rather thoroughly. There was the family solicitor, a Mr. Aldous Grimwade, thin and precise, who had known the Thornleighs for 30 years, and who kept glancing toward the window, as though he had somewhere else he would rather be. And there was the vicar, Mr. Hale, a mild, stooped man, who had baptized, married, and now would bury the last of the Thornleighs, and who seemed, of everyone in the room, the most genuinely grieved. Peter Thornleigh, the nephew, hovered near the fire, saying little. It was Margaret who did most of the talking, filling the silence the way anxious people often do, as though the quiet itself were something to be feared. "You must understand, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "The family has always spoken of the curse. Every Thornleigh heir, back to the first Sir Roger, has died before his 32nd birthday, and always, always within these walls. Edward knew it. He used to joke about it, dreadfully, at dinner. And now—" She stopped, her hand at her throat once more. "Now he has died within these walls, precisely as the story foretold," said Poirot. "It is, I grant you, a very tidy curse, almost too tidy, one might say, for something so old." Aunt Louisa's eyes narrowed at that, though she said nothing. Poirot rose, despite the fire's warmth, and asked to see the crypt. It lay beneath the small private chapel that adjoined the house, a narrow stair, worn smooth by centuries of feet, descending into a chamber of grey stone and older grief. Rows of tombs stretched into the dark, the Thornleighs of 5 centuries lying in careful, dusty order. The air was cold in the particular way of places that never see the sun, and it smelled of stone and candle smoke and something else, something Poirot could not, in that first moment, quite name. Edward's body had been removed, of course, but the spot where he had lain was still marked, a faint discoloration upon the stone, and beside it, a fresh candle had been placed by someone, out of respect or superstition, Poirot could not say which. He crouched, with some difficulty and a muttered complaint about his knees, and studied the floor a long moment in silence. "Tell me," he said at last, straightening, "who found him?" "Mrs. Pargeter," said Peter, "the housekeeper. And she found him. How, precisely?" "Lying down, you said, as though asleep." "That's what she told us. His hand was out, like this." Peter demonstrated, awkwardly, reaching toward the candle, almost. "Almost," Poirot repeated softly, "but not quite." He looked up at the narrow window set high in the crypt wall, through which a thin grey light now fell, and then at the old iron gate through which they had entered, and then, for a long moment, at nothing at all, only the dark rows of tombs, and the silence they kept so very well. "Mademoiselle Margaret tells me the family has always spoken of a curse," he said finally. "But I do not investigate curses, my friends. I investigate men. And men, unlike curses, always leave something behind." He turned, brushing the dust from his knees with visible distaste. "Come, I think it is time I met the rest of this household, and heard, from each of them, exactly where they were on the night that Edward Thornleigh went down into this crypt, and did not come up again." Voices in the house. Mrs. Pargeter received Poirot in the small sitting room off the kitchen, her hands folded over her apron, her broad face composed into the particular stillness of servants who have decided, in advance, to say only what is necessary. "I've been housekeeper here 11 years, sir," she said, before he had asked. "Since old Mr. Thornleigh's time. I knew Mr. Edward since he was a boy." "Then you knew him well," said Poirot, settling into the chair opposite her with the air of a man prepared to wait as long as required. "Tell me of that morning, not what you told the others, what you saw." She hesitated only a moment. "It was gone 8. I went down because the vicar had mentioned the gate. I took the lamp, sir, the little one that hangs by the chapel door. I called out, I don't rightly know why, there's never anyone to answer down there, and when there was no answer, I went in." "And you found him where?" "By his grandfather's tomb, lying on his side, near enough. His hand was out toward the candle. I thought at first he'd fainted. I've never seen a dead man before, sir. Not lying like that. He looked as if he might wake." "The candle, was it lit when you found it?" She frowned, as though the question surprised her. "No, sir. Burned right down. Just the stub left, and the wick gone black. But someone had lit it. A candle does not burn itself down for pleasure." "I suppose someone did, sir. I couldn't say who." "Was it usual," Poirot asked, "for a Thornleigh to keep a lit candle in the crypt?" Mrs. Pargeter's hands tightened slightly over her apron. "The family goes down sometimes, on the anniversary of a death, or before a wedding, to pay their respects. There's always a box of candles kept by the gate, for that purpose. Has been for years." "And was that box full, the morning you found him, or short by one?" She blinked. "I couldn't say, sir. I didn't think to look." Poirot inclined his head, as though this were precisely the answer he had expected, and thanked her with a courtesy that seemed, somehow, to trouble her more than any accusation would have done. Peter Thornleigh was easier to draw out, and rather more eager to be drawn. "I'll tell you plainly, Monsieur Poirot, I didn't get on with Edward. Nobody in this house will tell you that, because it isn't the done thing, but you'll hear it soon enough from Aunt Louisa if you press her, so I'd rather say it myself. That is refreshingly honest of you, monsieur. He was the eldest, you see. Everything came to him, the house, the land, what little money's left of it. I've lived here my whole life, and I own not one stone of it." Peter's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "That's motive enough for some detectives, I'd imagine." "It is motive enough for a great many things," Poirot agreed. "Where were you, that night?" "In my room, alone. I read until past midnight. I couldn't tell you exactly when I slept. No one can confirm this. No one ever can, in this house. We none of us watch each other as closely as you might hope." "And the curse," said Poirot, watching him closely now. "Did you believe in it?" Peter laughed, though without much humour. "I believed Edward was frightened of it, these last months. He'd gone strange, quiet, you understand, not himself. I put it down to the anniversary coming on. 31, you know." "The age it always happens. Frightened of what, precisely?" "I don't know. He wouldn't say. But he'd taken to going down to the crypt alone, in the evenings, which he never used to do. Aunt Louisa thought he'd taken up praying for old Sir Roger's soul. I thought—" He stopped. "You thought?" "I thought he was looking for something," Peter said finally. "I couldn't tell you what." Aunt Louisa gave her interview in the drawing-room, upright in her chair, as though the very posture were a form of disapproval. "I have lived in this house 61 years, Monsieur Poirot. I buried my brother here, and now I have buried his son. I do not require a foreigner to explain to me what a Thornleigh death looks like. I do not seek to explain it, madame. I seek only to understand it. Then understand this. Every heir who has died in this house has died at 31. My own brother, Edward's father, died at 31, in the East Wing, in his sleep, with no mark upon him, precisely as Edward has now died. The doctors called it his heart, then too. There was no murderer creeping about in 17. No, in 1891, when great-uncle Josiah went the same way. Are you suggesting some family of assassins has stalked this house for 200 years, each one obligingly retiring once his work was done? I suggest nothing yet, madame. I only observe that a story repeated often enough begins to feel like an explanation, when it is, in truth, only a story. Aunt Louisa's eyes were sharp and unimpressed. You will find no murderer here, Monsieur Poirot. You will find only an old family and an old debt it has always owed to its own blood. An interesting turn of phrase, said Poirot softly. A debt? What manner of debt, madame? But Aunt Louisa, having said more than she intended, drew her shawl about her shoulders and declared the interview at an end. It was Mr. Grimwade, the solicitor, who proved the most reluctant, and therefore, to Poirot's mind, the most interesting. I handle the family's affairs, Monsieur Poirot. I am not able to discuss the particulars. I do not ask you to breach a confidence, monsieur. I ask only, who inherits, now that Edward is gone? Grimwade's fingers drummed once upon his knee. The estate passes to the nearest surviving male heir, in this case, Mr. Peter Thornleigh. And the estate, is it a valuable one? The land, yes. The house is a considerable burden, in truth. There are debts, Monsieur Poirot. Old ones. The family has not been as prosperous these last decades as its name would suggest. Debts, Poirot repeated. Owed to whom? Grimwade's mouth tightened into something that was almost, but not quite, a refusal. To a great many parties, over a great many years. I would not wish to single out any one of them without cause. Then let us speak of cause, monsieur. Was Edward aware of these debts? He had begun to ask questions, Grimwade admitted, slowly, as though each word cost him something. In the last month or two, he came to my office in the town, twice, wanting to see the old accounts going back, if you can credit it, to his great-grandfather's time. I did not entirely understand what he was searching for, but he found something. He said very little to me, Monsieur Poirot, but the last time he left my office, he did not look like a man reassured. He looked like a man who had learned something he wished he had not. Poirot sat a long moment with this, his small eyes very still. 3 days before he died, he said softly, Edward Thornleigh began to search his family's past. And 3 days later, he was found in the crypt where that past is buried, with a candle burned to nothing beside his hand. He rose, smoothing his waistcoat with careful fingers. I think, Monsieur Grimwade, it is time I saw those old accounts for myself. What the stone remembered. The old accounts arrived in a leather trunk, carried down by 2 footmen and set before the fire in the library, and Poirot spent the better part of that afternoon among them, his spectacles perched upon his nose, his fingers stained faintly grey with the dust of decades. They told, in the dry language of ledgers, a story the family had evidently preferred not to tell aloud. There were debts, as Grimwade had said, mortgages taken against the land as far back as 1902, renewed and renewed again, never quite repaid. There were sums paid out, year after year, to a name Poirot did not recognize, T. Whitfield and Sons, Solicitors, London. And there was, tucked between 2 brittle pages near the back of the trunk, a letter, unsigned, undated, the ink gone the colour of weak tea, which spoke of the arrangement and what must never come to Sir Roger's ears. Poirot read it 3 times before he set it carefully aside. George, he said to his manservant, who had been permitted, that evening, to unpack his master's things in the room assigned to him. I believe I begin to see the shape of this house's trouble. Not a curse, George, a very old, very patient piece of dishonesty. Very good, sir, said George, who had heard this sort of remark before, and had learned not to press for more until Poirot was ready to give it. But Poirot was not yet ready. He wished, first, to return to the crypt, alone, and without the housekeeper's lamp to guide him, for he had begun to suspect that light itself was the very heart of the matter. He went down that evening, after the household had retired, a small electric torch in his coat pocket, and his mind entirely fixed upon the problem of the candle. The crypt was colder at night, or perhaps it only seemed so, with the house asleep above, and no voices to soften the silence. Poirot descended the worn stair slowly, minding his knees, and stood a long moment at the bottom, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. The box of candles stood exactly where Mrs. Pargeter had said, on a small stone shelf beside the gate. He counted them. 11 remained, and the box, by its size, had clearly once held a dozen. He turned his torch upon the spot where Edward had lain. The discoloration on the stone was still there, faint and brownish, and beside it, the fresh candle someone had left stood untouched, its wick still white. Poirot crouched, as he had done before, and this time he did not rise so quickly. He studied the stub of the burned candle, which he had asked to be kept, and which now sat wrapped in a handkerchief in his coat pocket. He drew it out and turned it over in the torchlight. A candle, ordinary enough, tallow, not wax, of the plain sort kept in the box by the gate. But something about the burning troubled him. He held it closer. The wick had burned down evenly, cleanly, as a candle burns when it is left undisturbed to consume itself entirely. There was no guttering, no unevenness such as a draught would cause. And yet the crypt was not without its draughts. He had felt one himself, faint but constant, moving down from the narrow window near the ceiling. A candle that burns too politely, he murmured to himself, in a room that is not polite at all. He rose and walked the length of the crypt, his torch passing over tomb after tomb, until he reached the far wall, where the oldest Thornleighs lay beneath worn stone effigies, their names softened by centuries into near illegibility. Here the wall was different from the rest, not smooth-cut stone, but rougher, older, patched in places with mortar of a much newer color than its surroundings. Poirot pressed his palm against it. Cool, damp, ordinary stone, and yet his fingers, moving along the join where old met new, found a seam that did not sit quite true. He worked at it a long moment, his breath fogging faintly in the cold, until a section of the wall, no more than 2 feet square, shifted very slightly beneath his hand. Not a door, not quite, but a stone set into the wall more recently than its neighbors, and set, moreover, by someone who had not wished the fact to be noticed. He did not force it further that night. He had learned, over many years and many crypts, that a secret disturbed too roughly has a way of destroying itself before it can be properly read. He made note of its position, extinguished his torch, and climbed the stair back into the sleeping house, his mind turning over what he had found, like a man turning a coin to see both its faces. He found Peter Thornleigh in the breakfast room the following morning, alone, staring into a cup of tea that had gone cold without his noticing. "You look, monsieur, like a man who has slept badly." "I haven't slept at all, if you want the truth of it." Peter looked up, and there was something new in his face. Not grief exactly, but a kind of wariness. "I keep thinking about what you said, about the candle, about someone lighting it. And what do you think, now that you have thought of little else all night?" "I think," Peter said slowly, "that Edward wasn't alone down there. He couldn't have been. He was terrified of the dark, Monsieur Poirot, had been since we were boys. He'd never have gone down to that crypt at night, sat there long enough to burn a candle to nothing, unless he was waiting for someone, or unless someone had asked him to." "Now that," said Poirot, seating himself opposite with evident interest, "is the first genuinely useful thing anyone in this house has told me." Peter's hand tightened around his cup. "There's something else. I didn't mention it before because it seemed, I don't know, disloyal somehow. But the night before he died, I heard him on the telephone in the hall, late. He didn't know I was on the stair. He said, I remember it exactly. He said, 'I know what you did, and I mean to see it put right, whatever it costs the family name.'" "Whom was he speaking to?" "I couldn't say, but he sounded frightened, Monsieur Poirot. Not angry, frightened." Poirot sat very still, his small eyes fixed on some point beyond Peter's shoulder, and when he spoke again, it was almost to himself. A young man discovers an old dishonesty. He threatens to make it right, whatever it costs, and 3 days later, He is found in the very crypt where that dishonesty, I begin to think, has been quite literally built into the wall." He rose abruptly. "Monsieur Thornleigh, I must ask you a question, and I ask you to answer it with great care. Is there anyone remaining in this house, or connected to it, who might have had cause to fear what Edward had learned from those old accounts?" Peter was quiet a long moment. "There's Grimwade, of course. His firm has handled our affairs for 2 generations, his father before him. If there's dishonesty in those books, it likely runs through his hands as much as ours." He hesitated. "And there's the other matter, which I don't like to speak of, because it touches Aunt Louisa, and she's an old woman, and I can't believe—" "Tell me regardless, monsieur. Belief is a luxury I cannot yet afford. Her own inheritance was settled oddly, years ago. There was talk, when I was a boy, that she'd been left less than she ought, and that the difference had gone somewhere. She never speaks of it. But I've always thought there was a reason she guards this house so fiercely, Monsieur Poirot. As though she were guarding something in it, rather than merely living in it." Poirot's expression did not change, but something in his stillness sharpened. "Merci, Peter. You have given me a great deal to consider." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. That letter your cousin found, the telephone call. Do you know if Edward kept any record of what he had learned? A notebook, perhaps? Men who discover secrets rarely trust them to memory alone." "He kept a small black notebook," Peter said slowly. "Always in his coat pocket. I haven't seen it since he died." "Then," said Poirot quietly, "I think we have found what someone in this house was truly looking for. On the night Edward Thornleigh went down into the dark and did not come up again. The vicar's confession. The notebook did not turn up that day, nor the next, though Poirot had the household searched with a thoroughness that left Mrs. Pargeter murmuring darkly about foreigners and their notions of hospitality. It was not in Edward's room, nor in his desk, nor among his effects in the small study he had kept at the end of the east corridor. A room, Poirot noted, that looked out directly upon the chapel roof, as though Edward, in his final weeks, had wished to keep the crypt always within sight. "It is not lost, George," Poirot said, standing at that window on the second morning, his hands clasped behind his back. "It has been taken, and a man does not take a notebook unless he fears very greatly what is written in it. Perhaps it was destroyed, sir. Perhaps, but destruction is easy to accomplish and difficult to be certain of." "No, I think it has been hidden, not burned. Somewhere close, somewhere the taker believed safe from a curious Belgian's eye. It was the vicar, Mr. Hale, who came to him that afternoon, unbidden, his hands folded before him, in the manner of a man rehearsing a confession he had not yet found the courage to make. Monsieur Poirot, may I speak with you a moment, somewhere private?" They walked together in the small walled garden behind the chapel, where the last of the autumn roses hung brown and heavy on their stems, and Mr. Hale, for some minutes, said nothing at all, as though the walking itself were a kind of preparation. "I have known this family my whole life," he said at last. "I baptized Edward. I buried his father. I had thought, when you arrived, that I had nothing to add to what the others would tell you. I see now that I was wrong to think so. Go on, Monsieur le Curé. Edward came to me 3 weeks before he died. He did not come as a man comes to confess a sin, you understand. He came as a man comes seeking counsel. He told me he had found something in the old accounts that troubled him deeply. He would not say what, not fully. But he asked me a question I have not been able to forget." The vicar paused among the dead roses. "He asked me whether a wrong done 50 years ago by people long since dead could still be called a wrong at all, or whether time itself absolved it. And what did you tell him?" "I told him that time absolves nothing. Only truth does that." "I have regretted the answer every day since, Monsieur Poirot, for I believe it sent him down into that crypt to find his truth, and it seems the truth did not wish to be found." "You believe he went seeking evidence, something buried, physically, rather than merely written?" "I believe so, yes." "He asked me," That same evening, about the old wall at the far end of the crypt, the one patched with newer stone. He asked whether I knew when the repair had been made. I told him I did not, that it had been done long before my own time in the parish. He thanked me and said no more of it. Poirot's eyes had grown very still. "And did you tell anyone else of this conversation, Mr. Hale?" The vicar's face coloured faintly. "I mentioned it to Mr. Grimwade some days later, quite in passing. I did not think it a matter for secrecy at the time. I did not know then that it would matter. Everything matters, monsieur. That is the first lesson of my profession, and the last." Poirot inclined his head. "You have been of great service today, whether or not it feels so to you." He found Grimwade in the library that evening, replacing the last of the old ledgers into their trunk, his movements careful, almost tender, as though he were laying something to rest. "You knew," Poirot said, without preamble, that Edward had asked the vicar about the wall in the crypt. Grimwade's hands stilled over the trunk. "I did not think it significant, and yet you did not mention it to me, when I asked you directly what Edward had been searching for." "I did not think," Grimwade began, and stopped himself, and in the stopping, Poirot saw something give way behind the solicitor's careful composure. "Monsieur Grimwade, I will tell you what I believe, and you will correct me where I am wrong. I believe that some 50 years ago, a sum of money belonging rightfully to this family, or perhaps to another party altogether, was diverted, quietly, through the offices of your firm, and that some record of that diversion was concealed, quite literally, within the fabric of that crypt, by someone who trusted that a room of the dead keeps its secrets better than any safe. I believe Edward found reference to this in the old accounts, and that he came to you, and to the vicar, seeking to understand what he had found before he confronted it directly. And I believe that someone in this house discovered his intentions before he could act upon them." The silence that followed was long enough that Poirot heard, quite distinctly, the fire settling in the grate. "It was not my doing," Grimwade said finally, very quietly. "It was my father's. The arrangement was made in 1897, before I had any part in the firm's affairs. I inherited the knowledge of it along with the ledgers, Monsieur Poirot, the way one inherits a debt one did not incur. What was the arrangement? There was a claim against the estate. A woman, a governess, who had been in the household some years before, who bore old Sir Roger a child out of wedlock. The family paid to keep the matter quiet, for 2 generations, through a trust my father administered. The payments continued for years, and then, some 50 years ago, they simply stopped. Stopped? How? The money was said to have been paid in full, the claim settled, the matter closed. But I have found no record of a final settlement, Monsieur Poirot, only a gap in the accounts, precisely where such a record ought to be. I have long suspected, though I have never dared voice it, that the money was not paid out at all, that it was kept, absorbed into the estate, quietly, by whoever administered it at the time. And who administered it at the time the payments ceased? Grimwade's eyes, when he raised them, were unhappy. My father, Monsieur Poirot, and, in her own capacity as the eldest surviving Thornleigh of her generation, Miss Louisa. Poirot said nothing for a long moment, turning this new fact over, as a man turns a stone to see what lies beneath. "There is a child, then," he said at last. "Or there was one. What became of it? I do not know. The trail ends with the final payment recorded, 1902. After that, nothing. If the claim was truly settled, there should be a discharge, a receipt, some paper proving the family's obligation had ended honorably. There is none. Only silence, and a gap where honesty ought to have stood." Poirot rose from his chair with the slow deliberation of a man who has just been handed the final, missing piece of a puzzle he has turned over for days. "Monsieur Grimwade, I believe the wall at the end of the crypt does not conceal money, nor jewels, nor any treasure so simple. I believe it conceals a name, the name of a child who was owed an inheritance and never received it. And I believe Edward Thornleigh, 3 days before his death, came very close indeed to learning that name. He moved toward the door, then turned back, his expression graver than Grimwade had yet seen it. "Tell me one more thing, monsieur, and tell me truthfully. Aunt Louisa spoke to me of a debt the family owes to its own blood. I took it, at the time, for a figure of speech. I begin to think now that she meant it with rather more precision than I credited." Grimwade's face had gone the color of old paper. "I have wondered the same thing, Monsieur Poirot, more nights than I care to admit, but I have never had the courage to ask her directly." "Then," said Poirot softly, "it seems that courage, tonight, must be mine." What Louisa would not say he found her in the drawing room, exactly where he had first met her, upright in her chair by the fire, her hands folded over a piece of needlework she had not, Poirot suspected, touched all evening. "You have the look, Monsieur Poirot, of a man who has come to accuse an old woman of something." "I have come, madame, to ask her to stop accusing herself, in silence, of the same thing for 50 years. Aunt Louisa's needle stilled. "I know of the governess," Poirot said, seating himself without invitation. "I know of the child. I know that the payments recorded in your family's accounts ceased in 1902, and that no discharge of the debt was ever entered against them. I know that you and Mr. Grimwade's father administered that trust together in the final years of its existence." For a long moment she said nothing, and the fire cracked and settled between them, and Poirot waited, as he had learned to wait, with the patience of a man who understood that silence, given enough room, would eventually break itself. "You think I stole from a child," she said at last, and her voice, when it came, was not the voice of the sharp old woman who had received him 3 days before. It was smaller, older. "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that something was done 50 years ago that you have carried since as a burden far heavier than any curse." "Tell me the truth of it, madame, and let us see together whether it is truly the crime you have punished yourself for all these years." Louisa was quiet a long while, her eyes fixed on the fire. "My brother, Edward's grandfather, was a weak man, Monsieur Poirot, though I loved him. He fathered a child on a governess in this house, and when the scandal threatened to break upon us, our father settled a trust upon the child rather than see the family name dragged through the courts of every newspaper in London. I did not object to this. I thought it right. But by 1902, the estate itself was drowning. The mortgages, the debts. You have seen the accounts yourself. My father came to me and told me there was no longer money enough to honor both the estate and the trust. He asked me to choose. And you chose the house." "I chose the house," she said, and for the first time, Poirot heard something like grief in it, old and worn smooth by 50 years of handling. "The final payment was never made. I told myself the child had been provided for well enough already. A decent sum, a decent start. I told myself many things, Monsieur Poirot, across 50 years, and some nights I even believed them. Do you know what became of the child? A boy, given the name of the town where he was raised, as such children often were. Whitfield, I believe, after the solicitor who arranged his placement. I never sought to learn more. I did not wish to know whether he had prospered or starved, for either answer would have been unbearable to me." Poirot went very still. "Whitfield," he repeated softly. "The same name recorded in your ledgers. Payments made, for years, to T. Whitfield and Sons, solicitors, London." Louisa looked at him properly for the first time. I had not connected the two. I swear to you, Monsieur Poirot, I had not thought of it in years. I think, madame, that someone else in this house connected them very recently indeed. Poirot rose slowly. Edward found the same name in the same ledgers. He went to Mr. Grimwade and to the vicar, asking careful questions, and I believe, though I cannot yet prove it, that his questions reached the ears of someone who did not wish an old debt, so long buried, to walk back through the front door of Thornleigh Hall and claim what was owed it. You think the child, the man now, he would be past 50. You think he came here, that he is real, and living, and that he— Louisa could not finish it. I think it is time, said Poirot gently, "that we discover whether Mr. Whitfield of London has any living connection to this house, beyond a name in an old ledger. And I think, madame, you have carried this alone long enough. Whatever judgment falls upon this house, it need not fall on you twice over, once from your conscience, and once again from a jury that does not yet exist." It was George who found the answer, 2 days later, having been dispatched to London with instructions so precise that even he, who had long ago ceased to be surprised by his employer, had raised an eyebrow at the telegram Poirot composed before breakfast. "The firm of T. Whitfield and Sons dissolved in 1931, sir," George reported, laying his notes before Poirot with the neat efficiency of long practice. "The senior partner, Thomas Whitfield, died the same year. But there was a junior clerk in the firm's final years, a Mr. Arthur Whitfield, taken on, according to the old staff registry, as an act of charity by the senior partner, who was, the registry notes, his godfather." "His godfather," Poirot murmured. "Or, perhaps, something rather closer than that." "Arthur Whitfield left the firm upon its dissolution, sir, and I found him, it took some doing, practicing now under his own name, in a small office near Gray's Inn, a solicitor of modest means, sir, unmarried, nothing remarkable in his history at all, until 3 weeks ago, sir, when the firm's records show he made a journey to Kent." Poirot sat back slowly in his chair, his small eyes very bright. "3 weeks ago," he repeated, "precisely when Edward Thornleigh began asking his questions of old ledgers and older walls." He rose, reaching for his coat. "George, I believe it is time we paid a call upon Mr. Arthur Whitfield ourselves, and asked him, quite directly, what business brought a solicitor of modest means to a Kentish village he had, by every account, no earthly reason to visit. The man from Gray's Inn." The office was small, up 2 flights of narrow stairs above a tobacconist's shop, the sort of place where the dust seemed to have settled into the very grain of the furniture. Arthur Whitfield rose from behind his desk when they entered, a thin, grey-haired man of perhaps 55, his collar a little worn, his eyes tired in the manner of men who have spent a lifetime doing careful work for very little reward. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, and there was no surprise in it, only a kind of weariness, as though he had been expecting this visit for some time and was almost relieved it had finally come. "I wondered how long it would take." "You knew I would come." "I knew someone would, once Edward began asking his questions." Whitfield gestured them to 2 chairs that did not quite match, and sat heavily in his own. "I read of his death in the newspaper. I have read little else since." "Then let us not waste what remains of either of our patients, monsieur. Tell me who you are, and what brought you to Kent 3 weeks ago." Whitfield was silent a moment, his hands folded upon the desk before him, and when he spoke, it was the voice of a man setting down a weight he had carried a very long way. "My mother was a governess at Thornleigh Hall, Monsieur Poirot, before I was born. I never knew her. She died when I was an infant, and I was raised by the firm's senior partner, Thomas Whitfield, who took me in, he always said, as an act of charity. I did not learn the truth until I was a grown man, going through his private papers after his death. There was a file, kept separate from all the others, marked only with a date and a sum. It took me a long while to understand what I was reading. You learned that you were a Thornleigh. I learned that I should have been provided for as one, and was not," Whitfield said, and something hard entered his voice for the first time. "The payments to my keeping ceased in 1902, Monsieur Poirot. I was 7 years old. Thomas Whitfield continued to educate me and place me in the firm out of his own conscience, not the family's generosity. The family's generosity, it turned out, had run dry the moment it became inconvenient. And you did nothing, all these years, with this knowledge. What was there to do? I had no proof beyond an old man's private notes, no documents bearing the Thornleigh name that I could take before a court. I made my peace with it, or told myself I had, and I built what life I could." He looked up, and his eyes were very tired. "Then, 6 weeks ago, I received a letter, From Edward. Poirot leaned forward slightly. He wrote to you. He had found my name in the old estate ledgers. Payments to Whitfield and Sons, unexplained beyond a reference to the arrangement. He was a conscientious young man, Monsieur Poirot, more than his family perhaps deserved. He wrote to ask, quite simply, whether I knew anything of the matter. I did not answer at first. I did not know how, but he wrote again, more urgently, saying he had begun to suspect a wrong had been done and meant to see it righted, whatever it cost the family name to do so. And so you went to see him? I went to see him, yes, 3 weeks ago. I told him everything I have just told you. I expected him to be embarrassed, perhaps, or dismissive. Families do not, in my experience, welcome the sudden appearance of debts 50 years buried. But he was not embarrassed, Monsieur Poirot. He was ashamed, on his family's behalf, and determined to correct it. He told me he intended to go through every record in the house until he found proof of what had been owed and never paid, and that when he found it, he would see it made right, out of his own portion if necessary. When did you last see him? That same evening. I took the last train back to London. I have not set foot in Kent since. Whitfield's voice caught, very slightly. I did not kill him, Monsieur Poirot, if that is what you have come to ask. I had no reason to. He was the one person in that house who meant to give me what was owed. His death has cost me the only friend the Thornleigh name ever produced. Poirot studied him a long moment in silence, and something in the stillness of his study seemed, gradually, to satisfy him. I believe you, monsieur, he said at last. But I think there is someone else in that house who learned of Edward's intentions before you did. Someone who stood to lose a great deal more than a family's pride, should your claim ever come to light and require satisfying from an already drowning estate. Tell me, Monsieur Whitfield, in your letters to Edward, or his to you, was any other name in that household ever mentioned? Whitfield frowned, thinking back. Only once. In his last letter to me, he mentioned that he had confided in the family solicitor, a Mr. Grimwade, hoping the man might help him locate the final discharge papers, if any existed. He said Grimwade had seemed troubled by the request and had asked him, rather pointedly, not to raise the matter with the rest of the family until the records could be properly reviewed. Poirot's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened to a fine point. Grimwade, he said softly, asked him to wait. That is what Edward wrote, yes. And 3 days later, Edward was dead, and his notebook, in which, I do not doubt, he had recorded every particular of his search, including his correspondence with you, monsieur, has vanished from the house entirely. Poirot rose abruptly, his small frame suddenly full of purpose. George, we return to Kent tonight. There is a solicitor at Thornleigh Hall who has been rather more careful with the truth than a man in his position ought to be, and I think it is time I asked him why. They arrived back at the hall past 10 that evening, the house dark save for a single lit window on the ground floor, the library, where, Poirot was informed by a sleepy footman, Mr. Grimwade had asked to work late upon the estate papers before his return to town in the morning. Poirot did not wait to be announced. He crossed the hall swiftly, George a pace behind him, and pushed open the library door to find the room lit only by a single lamp upon the desk, and Grimwade nowhere within it. The desk itself had been disturbed. Papers lay scattered, the trunk of old ledgers pulled open, its contents disarranged in a way that spoke of haste rather than research. And there, half hidden beneath a fallen stack of accounts, Poirot's eye caught a small object bound in worn black leather. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and lifted it. Edward's notebook, at last, its pages filled with the young man's careful, anxious handwriting. George, Poirot said, his voice suddenly urgent, find Mr. Grimwade, now. I do not like the feeling of this room at all. They found him not 10 minutes later, in the chapel above the crypt, standing before the old iron gate with a candle in his hand, unlit, and an expression upon his face that Poirot had seen before, in other rooms, on other men, in the last moments before a truth too heavy to carry any further, finally broke its bearer entirely. "Monsieur Grimwade," Poirot said quietly, stepping into the chapel's cold. "I think it is time you told me exactly what happened, the night Edward Thornleigh went down into that crypt, and why you asked him to wait. The truth in the candlelight." Grimwade did not answer at once. He stood before the iron gate a long moment, the unlit candle trembling faintly in his hand, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the careful, precise solicitor Poirot had first met 3 days before. "You already know, don't you, Monsieur Poirot? I can see it in your face." "I know a great deal, monsieur. I would rather hear the rest from you than assemble it myself from silence and inference. A man deserves that much, even a man who has done what I believe you have done." Grimwade's shoulders sank. He set the candle down upon the stone ledge beside the gate, as though he could no longer bear the weight of holding it. "It was not my crime, Monsieur Poirot. Not at first. My father administered the Whitfield Trust in its final years, alongside Miss Louisa. When the estate began to founder, he did what he believed necessary to save it. He diverted what remained of the trust into the general accounts, disguised the transaction as a series of small, unremarkable payments, and told no one but himself. He died believing he had done a hard thing for a good reason, and he left the secret to me, along with the ledgers, the way a man leaves a debt to his son. And you continued it. I inherited a firm already built upon that first dishonesty, and an estate already dependent upon my silence to survive. What was I to do, Monsieur Poirot? Confess a fraud that was not even mine, and watch this family lose the last of what little it had left? I told myself, as my father must have told himself, that it harmed no one living. Arthur Whitfield had built a quiet life in London. He had never come asking. I let myself believe the matter was closed, until Edward opened it again. "Until Edward opened it again," Grimwade repeated, and his voice broke slightly on the name. "He came to me with such earnestness, Monsieur Poirot, such determination to do right by a stranger he had never met, simply because it was right. I asked him to wait, to let me review the old records properly before he went further, and I meant it, at first, quite honestly. I hoped I might find some way to make a partial restitution quietly, without ruin falling on either the family or my own firm. But you found no such way. I found only the truth of how deep the dishonesty ran, my father's hand in it, and my own, in every small deception since. And I understood that if Edward pursued his notebook, his letters to Whitfield, his questions to the vicar, it would not end in a quiet restitution. It would end in an inquiry. My father's name, ruined after his death. My own career, ended. Perhaps prison, Monsieur Poirot, for a crime I inherited rather than committed, but would answer for regardless." Poirot's voice, when he spoke, was very quiet. "And so you asked Edward to meet you here, alone, on the pretense of showing him proof that would put the matter to rest." Grimwade's eyes closed. "I told him I had found an old discharge paper, misfiled among Sir Roger's private effects, kept in the chest beside his tomb. I told him it would prove the debt had been honourably settled after all, and that if he read it himself, in the crypt, among the family's own dead, he would understand why the matter ought to stay buried with them. It was foolish, theatrical even, but I knew Edward. I knew he was drawn to this place, to its history, to the weight of it. I knew he would come, and come alone, and wait as long as necessary for me to arrive with the paper I had promised." "There was no paper. There was no paper," Grimwade agreed, his voice barely above a whisper now. "There was only a candle, Monsieur Poirot, which I had prepared beforehand, in my office, with a compound I had learned of years ago, quite by accident, in a case my firm once handled. A poison that does its work slowly, in a closed and airless place, and leaves almost nothing behind for a country doctor to find. I lit it myself when I arrived, told Edward I had left the paper in my carriage and would fetch it directly, and left him there to wait, in that cold, still air, with a candle burning steadily beside him. And you did not return. I could not make myself return. Grimwade's voice had gone entirely to ash. I walked the grounds for an hour, telling myself I would go back, that there was still time to stop it, that I might simply blow out the candle and confess everything to him instead. I did not go back, Monsieur Poirot. When I finally found the courage to descend those stairs again, it was already done. He was lying exactly as Mrs. Pargeter found him the next morning. I did not move him. I did not touch anything, except, he stopped, except the notebook. I searched his coat and found it there, and I took it, because I could not bear the thought of anyone reading what he had written of me in his own hand. His trust in me, Monsieur Poirot, recorded so plainly, so undeservedly, in his own careful writing. I have carried it since like a stone in my own chest. Tonight, I meant to destroy it at last, and could not do even that. He looked up, and there were tears now, unashamed, running freely down a face that had held itself so carefully composed for 3 long days. I did not think of it as murder, Monsieur Poirot. God forgive me. I told myself I was only removing an obstacle. It was only when I stood in this chapel tonight, candle in hand, that I understood at last precisely what I had done, and what I had become in the doing of it. They gathered in the drawing room an hour later, at Poirot's quiet request, Aunt Louisa in her customary chair by the fire, Peter standing near the window with his arms folded, Margaret pale and silent upon the settee, Mrs. Pargeter hovering uncertainly near the door, and the vicar seated beside her, his hands folded in the manner of a man already praying for a soul not yet departed. Grimwade himself sat apart from the others, under the watchful eye of the local constable Poirot had summoned by telephone, his head bowed, his composure entirely gone. I promised you the truth of this house, Poirot began, standing before the fire with his hands clasped behind him, and I find, as I so often do, that the truth was never a curse at all, but only an old dishonesty, patiently waiting to be found by an honest man. He told them then, plainly and without embellishment, all that he had learned, the governess, the child, the trust betrayed twice over by 2 generations of the same careful hand, and the candle that had carried a young man's curiosity into the family's oldest darkness and left him there. Aunt Louisa did not speak throughout the telling. When Poirot had finished, she rose from her chair, slowly, leaning upon her stick, and crossed the room to where Grimwade sat. "You might have come to me," she said, and her voice, for the first time in 3 days, held no sharpness at all, only a terrible, tired sorrow. "I have carried this same guilt 50 years, Mr. Grimwade. You might have shared the weight of it, rather than adding a young man's life to the sum of what we owe." Grimwade said nothing. There was, perhaps, nothing left to say. It was Peter who broke the silence that followed, his voice unsteady. "And Whitfield, Arthur Whitfield, what becomes of him now?" "That," said Poirot, "is a question for Mr. Grimwade's successor, and for whatever remains of this estate once the law has taken its due course. But I think, monsieur, that a family which has finally learned the cost of an old silence would do well to end it properly, this time, and see that a debt 50 years unpaid is paid at last, not from fear of discovery, but because it is right." Aunt Louisa, still standing, still leaning upon her stick, nodded slowly, as though some long-carried burden had, at last, been given somewhere to rest. "Then let it be paid," she said, "in full, whatever it costs this house. Edward would have wished it so, and I find, tonight, that I no longer have the strength to wish otherwise." The constable led Grimwade away within the hour, the man offering no resistance, no further words, only a last glance toward the chapel roof, visible through the drawing-room window, as though some part of him remained down in that cold crypt with the truth he had tried, for 3 days, to keep buried. Poirot left Thornleigh Hall the following morning, the mud of the lane no kinder to his shoes than it had been on his arrival, though he found, this time, that he minded it rather less. "A sad affair, sir," George ventured, as they waited upon the platform for the London train. "A very sad affair, George, and yet not, I think, so very different from most human sadness. A small dishonesty, permitted to grow in the dark for want of anyone brave enough to bring a light to it, until at last it required a young man's life to be seen at all. Poirot straightened his coat and looked back, once, toward the grey stone house upon the hill, its ivy stirring faintly in the morning wind. The Thornleighs believed for 2 centuries that their family was cursed. I think, in the end, they were only ordinary, capable of great kindness and great cowardice, in equal and very human measure. It is not a curse, George. It is simply what happens when the truth is asked to wait too long. The train arrived, and Hercule Poirot, adjusting his moustaches with careful fingers, climbed aboard and left little Hadley and its crypt and its last burned candle behind him.